let's go ahead and get started. My name is Grant Martzoff. I know almost everybody here. I am the director of the Pitt School of Nursing's Nursing Health Services and Policy Research Hub. And this here is our twice monthly research colloquium. So as many of you know, we have a whole range of topics that we cover. A lot of them are very much empirical health services research. But one thing that we're really trying to do here is include some talks that deal with issues that are not often within the purview of nursing health services research, particularly around political theory and sort of a more capacious understanding of health and human flourishing and how that interacts with the state and also with civil society. So I thought Luke and I are friends. We are in a reading group together, and we were talking about his recent book called Why Associations Matter, and I read it recently, and I thought that some of his thinking would be an interesting way to sort of integrate, again, some of the political theory and understanding of political science. So without further ado, I want to introduce Luke Sheahan. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Duquesne and also a non-resident scholar in the program for research on religion and urban civil society at the University of Pennsylvania, where I believe you also did your postdoc. Is that right?
No, just
oh no, okay, sorry, my fault. And again, Luke has written a book recently called Why Associations Matter, which is a discussion of First Amendment and voluntary associations. So I think that is it. And again, Luke, just to orient you to our group, we tend to be, there's a whole mix of clinical and social science researchers, mostly nurses, but actually, you know what? We have a little bit of a smaller group today. So I think maybe we can do really quick introductions so Luke, you have some sense of who's on the call. So why don't we go ahead? Why don't we start with Amy?
Sure. So I'm Amy. I'm a pediatric primary care nurse practitioner student at Pitt, and I've been working with Grant on the research hub.
And then Claudia?
Oops. I am Claudia Craig Byers. I am a professor in the Department of Health and Community Services, and I teach community health nursing.
And I see we have Laura.
Good morning, Luke. I'm Laura Fenimore. I am a professor of nursing here, and I teach leadership for DNP students who are interested in being health executives someday.
And then Kristen.
Hi, I'm Kristen Geely. I am a former Pitt postdoc, and now I'm faculty at the University of Texas at Arlington in the Graduate School of Nursing, and I'm an acute care pediatric nurse practitioner interested in how hospitals use nurse practitioners.
Cool. And then Liz Nilsson.
Hey, I'm Liz. I'm a PhD student here at Pitt. I'm also doing a DNP in acute care, and I'm looking at opioid prescribing for patients who have serious mental illness after surgeries.
Okay. And then Jen Seaman.
Hi, this is Jennifer Seaman. Welcome. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Acute and Tertiary Care, and my work looks at advancing primary palliative care strategies in several settings and clinician-family communication for patients who have lack of capacity for decision-making.
And then did I see Claire Champion as well? Looks like Claire may have disappeared. That's okay. All right, so Luke, without further ado, go ahead and get started. And then do you want questions throughout, or do you want us to wait until the end?
I guess wait until the end.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. All right. Thanks for everyone for coming, and Grant for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about a conception I'm working on, what I call the plural constitutional community. I'm going to give you a background on how I came across this term and this idea, how I think it fits into a lot of the research I've been doing on constitutionalism. I teach the constitutional law classes and some other law classes in the political science department here at Duquesne. So I'll explain how that concept works in, and then what I mean by why I think that's a more humane conception of our constitutional community then is what I call the political constitutional community, which is generally how it's been approached by political thinkers and by First Amendment scholars in particular. So I'll start off talking about Robert Nisbet, who was a famous 20th century sociologist, very prominent. He held positions at Berkeley and at Columbia, among other institutions. Talk about some of his ideas and how they've shaped my own research. He's a sociologist in political science. He said almost nothing about constitutionalism, and all of my work is on constitutionalism, but how he kind of shaped my thinking about that and why I think he's so helpful. I'll talk about his conception of community and his how he develops various conceptions of community, namely what he calls the political community and what he calls the plural community, and then how I use those ideas in my own work. And then talking about conceptions of constitutional order that I think uphold what I'm calling the plural constitutional community, and why I think that's more humane. So that'll be kind of the structure of how I go. So Robert Nisbet, famous 20th century sociologist, began his career at Berkeley. He ended his career as the Albert Schweitzer Chair at Columbia. He held other positions, a few in Europe, the University of Arizona. He was dean of the college at Riverside in the UC system. He wrote about 20 books throughout his career, focusing mainly upon the health of communities. His first book was called The Quest for Community, published in 1953. It's his most famous book. It was considered at the time pretty groundbreaking. The argument he makes in that book is that human beings are primarily driven by a quest for community. So they primarily want to be attached to other human beings and integrated into a meaningful communal enterprise. And that when they are, for political, historical reasons or economic reasons, are separated from the sense of community, it creates a sense of alienation. This can have ramifications, very severe political ramifications, as well as psychological ramifications. So there's been a longstanding research within sociology going back at least to the late 19th century that communities that are not as well integrated, that focus upon individualism rather than community, tend to have higher rates of suicide and other social pathologies associated with them. So this goes back to the work of Emil Durkheim in the late 19th and early 20th century. Robert Nisbet picks up on that and talks about it at great length. And so he says, writing in 1953, he says, I'm seeing a widespread sense of alienation. So looking at the studies coming out of sociology, but also political science and economics and even theology, is talking about human beings, not these kind of empowered individuals, but there's a sense of anxiety. This individual has been, of individuals being adrift from their firm loci of authority and meaning in their lives. He says this is going to have some devastating effects. And so he writes one of his opening lines in Quest for Community. He says, a specter is haunting the modern mind, the specter of insecurity. So the social groups that have given human beings a sense of meaning are in decline for various reasons. And he studies in that book the political sources of that decline. And he argues there that the reason all of these social groups that had done so much to integrate human beings into a strong sense of community, so he has in mind here families primarily, but also local communities, economic associations. So he talks about medieval guilds that have given people a firm sense of community around their vocation. These sorts of things had come into decline, and he is going to look at the political causes of it. So the changes in terms of how political power operates in regards to these types of associations. So he says these personal ties of kinship, local community, all sorts of small associations become less individuals' lives to the extent that individuals begin to view themselves not as members of these groups and not as an important part of them, a part of these larger enterprises, but as merely individuals, and individuals as an end to themselves, meaning they're autonomous, self-sufficing, stable. And that the point of history is to emancipate these individuals from those other types of communities, which can be sources of oppression, that is giving individuals identity rather than allowing individuals to develop their own sense of identity. And Nisbet writes, who can deny that, of course, these communities can be oppressive and they can be can impose upon individuals in a way that can suppress individual happiness and stuff along those lines. But we also see, as they recede in terms of their authority, that individuals do not, by and large, stop and adopt their own strong identities. In fact, they feel adrift. They become alienated from the society around them. Book came out, I think last year, called Alienated America by Timothy Carney. And he documents the kind of wide swaths of alienation, widespread alienation throughout American society. Not in all communities, but in many regions of the country are suffering from a large sense of alienation. So individuals very much separated from their religious communities, from their families, from the local communities, even from their jobs, wide unemployment. So people have no larger connection to the world around them, except through Netflix and their drug dealer. And that's, of course, can be very destructive in terms of for those people who are alienated. So he talks about how this sense of alienation is, whereas in the 19th century, the sense of liberation of the individual was a prime theme throughout all of the disciplines. We get into the 20th century, and the sense of, liberation is widespread throughout the 19th century. The sense of alienation becomes widespread throughout the scholarly disciplines in the 20th century. I mean, when he's writing in 1953, it's a little jarring to read it from the present when you think, well, 1953. I mean, what was he worried about when he's talking about decline in communities? He was noticing this unsteadiness. He talks about the family, for example. We look back, and some people talk about the heyday of the family in the 1950s, and Robert Nisbet talks about its institutional weakness. It's little more than a peripheral relationship. It has no real meaning and bearing in individuals' lives. He says that it's not going to cohere in terms of integrating individuals and socializing them effectively, given its institutional weakness. He's writing this in 1953 and kind of anticipating the decline in the meaning of the family. And by the family, he means something more than the nuclear family. He means the broader kinship groups that individuals have long been a part of, and the ways in which those kinship groups integrate individuals, socialize them, and connect them economically and politically and socially to all sorts of opportunities in terms of economics, as well as getting a job through your cousin or your uncle, but also the friendships that form through various branches of the family and stuff. It creates a widespread social network for individuals that they're embedded in, that can give them meaning, that can give them status, and that can help them progress economically and socially. So all of these things are in a widespread decline. The reason for this, he says, is it's primarily political. And his argument is that the modern state has come to take on all of the various functions that all of these groups used to provide. So whereas economic security came from one's family and one's, by family I mean widespread family, one's job, so being connected to a guild in the medieval period and that sort of thing, that's where economic security came from. The state provides it. It has various welfare programs that help to provide a sort of social safety net. And that can be very useful in many ways, but it does bereave some of these other institutions of the ability to integrate individuals separately. So the state historically has taken on more and more of the functions of various social groups. And the reason this happens is that basically in the early modern period, kings, to subdue the aristocracy and bring the church under its authority, started to take over the functions that the church had done. So charity functions the church had done, the king starts to become more and more involved in it. Regulation of property, which the aristocracy had done, the king starts to do more and more of it in order to subdue the aristocracy and the church under the governance of the monarchies. Those monarchies kind of transition through that process into what we think of as the modern state, and their political authority taking on more and more significance throughout their kingdoms. And then some of these, of course, transition into democratic governments, but the sense of political power as being all-encompassing arises in the early modern period, and it still very much suffuses democratic governments and the apparatus that surrounds democratic governance. Nisbet calls this the monism. So a sense that the state is the singular source of legitimate authority. And therefore the kind of the source of all good things. So the English king oversees the church in England. So kind of what's the ultimate source of religious values? Well, the king, at the end of the day, it's the monarch is the one that oversees and makes sure the church functions appropriately. And in terms of health and welfare, ultimately it's the king that regulates such things, that provides funding if needed be. So the king becomes the kind of sole source. And then individual identity. What's the primary source of individual identity? Well, it's one's membership in this political community. One's membership in a religious community or in family or in the local borough, but in the larger political community, whatever it is. So that is citizenship becomes the primary source of identity, individual citizenship and the sovereign power. So this becomes the primary relationship rather than one relationship among many. It's the primary relationship, and everything else is kind of subsumed or seen as subsidiary to that primary political relationship. Now, this understanding of political power is very old. It goes back at least to Plato and the Greeks. So Plato had argued in his famous main treatise, The Republic, that the primary moral community is the political community, the polis, and that individuals needed to be primarily oriented towards the good of the polis. And that meant for some factions of society having no families. So it has a guardian class in that book, and it's completely, it's supposed to be, they don't have any families, they live together communally, they reproduce without knowing who their children will be or who their children are. So there's no families for that guardian class. And the lower classes, Plato permits to have families, but it's more out of necessity. The goal is to orient all towards the political state. Nisbet kind of frames this as political affirmation and social annihilation. So that is the political power is affirmed through his theory, and social authorities. So distinguishes between political authority in the state and social authorities. It could be religion, occupation, economic occupation, family, any of those things that are non-political powers. Those are always annihilated and suppressed for the good of the political authority. Other thinkers along these lines, Nisbet calls them the political philosophers of the political community. Jean Bowdan and Thomas Hobbes, writing in the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries respectively, talking about the powers of the state as being all-encompassing and sovereign, absolute. When the prince speaks, he has the final word on everything. And then finally, the main thinker in this line of thinking is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in the late 18th century. And Rousseau, more than any other thinker, makes the state depicts the political community as the highest moral community. So it not only liberates individuals or provides security in terms of protecting us from violence. So Thomas Hobbes had talked about how human beings without the Leviathan state live in a state of nature, which is a state of war. We're all just trying to grapple with each other and fight and kill each other for resources. The state comes in, instills order, and we submit to it because it's better than getting killed in the state of nature. For Rousseau, though, the state of nature is actually very peaceful. What the state can do is help us coordinate, help us kind of free us from these social bonds that are, for Rousseau, inherently oppressive. So our families are inherently oppressive to us. Our religious ties are inherently oppressive. And so religion needs to be completely reconstituted to only encourage individuals to be subservient to the state. Now, while he's using this language of authoritarianism in terms of the state, he writes that individuals are actually free. And if individuals don't want to submit to the state, force them to submit is just merely to force them to be free. So any dissent from what the state might say is just what Marx would later call a false consciousness. These people don't understand what's actually good for them in terms of their liberation from the communities they think are important to So that's how Nisbet lays out the problem of the political community and what certain problems it can present for individuals. So if a state takes on a sort of Platonic or Hobbesian or Rousseauian aspects, it becomes overbearing. And there can be all sorts of benefits to this. I mean, the social safety net can be very helpful for individuals who need it, who are bereft of those other sort of associations. But it has the effect of alienation, which I said. That is the end effect on the citizens of the political community. And Nisbet writes at the end of Quest for Community, this is about a page and a half. He says, so, what do we do about all this? After he talks about it for 260 pages, he says, well, I think we want to see a revival of social groups. He doesn't give any specifics. He says, what we want is a laissez-faire of groups. We want all these social groups, the kinship groups, the economic groups, the local communities, all these things to be vying with each other, competing with each other for individuals. So we normally think of laissez-faire as being about individuals kind of competing in the marketplace, but we actually want our groups competing in the marketplace. And what are they competing for? They're competing for the allegiance of individuals by providing a strong sense of community. And which one provides the best sense of community gets to kind of win the allegiance of individuals. That's good for individuals. They're alienated, but because there's a variety of groups, we can hopefully avoid situations where the groups themselves can become too overbearing or oppressive. Now, he doesn't give us a whole lot of details. It's about a page and a half. He returns to it 20 years later in a different book, and he gives us about 3 pages. It just doesn't unpack it very much. But elsewhere, he talks about this idea of the plural community. So the idea of the plural community is a community that does not see as its primary goal one good, that is political order. That's what the political state is after. It's after political order and the allegiance of the individual citizens to the political order. It instead pursues a plurality of goods and permits a plurality of associations. So it's an overall community, but within it, there's a lot of different things that are being pursued. So I'm going to lay out what he gives as the 6 elements of this type of community, and then talk about the ramifications for how we might think about constitutional order in terms of these elements. So the 6 elements he lays out. The first is plurality. So what he means by that is, opposed to the monism of the political community, is plurality, variety. Not one single objective, but many objectives and pursuits this society sees as a good thing. The second element is functional autonomy. So what he means is each group is autonomous according to its function. Function of a religious group is to organize religious worship, and it will be as autonomous as possible to be able to carry out that function. Families exist to procreate and socialize the next generation. They will be autonomous as much as possible to carry out that function. Economic associations exist to produce some good and organize individuals around producing that good, be autonomous as possible toward that function, and so on. And the political state needs to maintain order, and it will have the authority necessary to maintain the order, and so on. The third element is decentralization. So he says the early modern kings and the political states that emerged from their authority, the whole movement was a centralization of power. Under the king, as he worked to take power away from his kind of competitors in the aristocracy and in the Catholic Church, as well as in the economic realm in terms of the guilds. The king's breaking up of those associations and bringing the authority underneath the monarchy should be decentralized as much as is possible. The fourth element is hierarchy. What he means by this is every group has a stratification of function and responsibility. Very simply, in very simple terms, there's leaders and members in a group. Any group, there's an organizer and there's the organized. A very simple dichotomy there. Think about universities have presidents, provosts, deans, full professors, associate professors, assistant professors. They have a hierarchy. The professors and the students, and these are the things, and he says that's just how it is across every association, and rather than rejecting it, so he's not having in mind here like oppressive hierarchies, but just a sense that there's always a stratification of function and responsibility. This is embraced. It's how communities function. Families, their parents and children, and universities, their professors and students, and so on. There's always this sort of stratification. The fifth element, tradition. By tradition, he means lowercase tradition. So we might think in terms of traditions, the customary and habitual, the way of being of various communities that arise from people living together and working together and interacting with each other. Ways that they interact that just kind of, and there's kind of some organic way in which all these their practices just emerge, but there's practices are kind of embedded within a lived, the way in which people live together in some manner. So that's even true of very student groups on our campuses have various small t traditions that kind of accompany just the way those group of students interact in that forum. And that an intrusion into those traditions that seem to be unimportant, but just these small practices, are actually have an integrating function to the individuals who are part of those various associations. And then finally, the idea of localism. So to focus upon neighborhood, small community, local association. That is the places where we have face-to-face interaction, and focusing upon that as being the real center of communal life. And that being psychologically necessary to individuals. So these are the 6 elements, and these elements are meant to ensure that the types of communities that really integrate individuals into a meaningful sense of community can exist. So how does this, and Nisbet sees this this plural community as, this conception has always existed. A lot of times it's existed kind of right alongside the conceptions of the political community. So for example, Plato is the first major thinker in terms of the political community, as Nisbet uses the term. Aristotle, the other famous Greek philosopher, is kind of the first major pluralist thinker. He says, looks at the polis and he says, well, there's a lot of different groups here. That kind of irreducible plurality in a polis. You can't, he says, Plato's wrong. You can't organize everything around the good of the polis. There's all these different groups that you have to take account of. It counts out various economic groups, various groups in terms of wealth, the fact that people will always look out for family members. You just have to take account of that. You can't pretend like the guardian class won't fall into nepotism. You have to take account of these kind of human nature in terms of how human beings interact and the needs they have. Johannes Althusius, writing in between Jean Bowdan in the 16th century and Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, was a pluralist thinker. Almost no one has ever read him. He was never famous, but he had this great kind of counter movement or counter argument to what was going on in terms of arguments for the king's power in 1600 and beyond. And he said, no, it's about a plurality of authorities. And focusing upon local communities and the local city and these sorts of things. Edmund Burke, writing right after Rousseau, Edmund Burke was a British thinker, and he says, actually, when we look at our constitutional order, so he's looking at England, he says what we see are a variety, plurality. I look around, I see the aristocracy, I see the monarchy, and I see the commoners. And we all come together in our governments through the House of Commons, House of Lords, and the monarchy. And I look around and I see an established church, but one that's actually independent of the crown. So that he sees the relationship between the Anglican establishment and the British crown as being more separate. And he looks around, he says, and he was a great defender of religious liberty of dissenter groups. Because there's a plurality of these religious communities, and that should be embraced. And we should see us all as part of this large plural community. Not Burke's term, that's Nisbet's term, but that's what he argues for. Now, Nisbet sees this conception of the plural community as being very politically ecumenical. So he does not see it as a particularly conservative conception or as a radical conception, right? It's anti-state, or as liberal, can be anti-state and on behalf of these local groups. He sees the modern ideologies that we call conservative, liberal, or radical as having a role in contributing to this plural understanding. So the conservative pluralists, that's like Edmund Burke would be considered a conservative pluralist. They want to preserve these traditional institutions. Burke talked about the family, the established church, democracy in England. I mean, these established a variety of associations. And he says that's, so that would be the conservative pluralist view. But there's a liberal pluralist view. Alexis de Tocqueville, who you've probably heard of, a Frenchman who visited America and wrote a very famous book called Democracy in America. His defense of, he comes to America and he observed that Americans are very much into creating associations. So America does not have an aristocracy that does kind of the great works, and society builds the roads and builds churches and that sort of thing, builds seminaries. Instead, associations do it. It says the normal citizens associate with each other around these variety of ends, and that's what a healthy democratic society does. So, but, you know, why is that important? Because of what it does for individuals. He says if individuals don't have these associations, they become alienated, and that's a danger in democratic society. So he's a pluralist, but he's a liberal pluralist. He's looking at the health of individuals specifically. And then radicals have a place at the table in pluralism as well. So there's two men, Pierre Joseph Perdon and Peter Kropotkin, writing like late 19th, early 20th century. They were both what you would call anti-Marxist radicals. So they opposed Marxism, but they thought it was too centralizing. It was just going to, the Marxist revolution was just going to bring about even more centralization in the state and probably more oppression. Instead, what we need is an overturning of society. They're radicals, remember. We want to overturn the social order, but we want to do it upon a plural basis. Our new society we're going to create is going to be based upon individual communes, spread out throughout society. So radical decentralization of political authority into a bunch of different groups, organized locally and communally, and he talks about communal ownership of property and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, their primary value guiding them is plurality. So this understanding of the plural community is being very, it doesn't attach to political ideologies as we understand them. Now, what does that mean in terms of thinking about a constitutional community? So when we have a constitutional order, so the overarching kind of political scheme, how does it operate? Does it operate in terms of the political community that Nisbet described, or does it operate in terms of the plural community that Nisbet described? So ways in which our constitutional order, so this is kind of where my research comes to bear on this question. Is it more of a plural constitutional community, or is it a political constitutional community? And when you read various scholars in terms of their First Amendment work, that's where I do most of my work, most of them are operating as what Nisbet would call philosophers of the political community. So that is, they see our constitutional order as being monistic. There's the political order, there's the individual citizen, and all of the other groups throughout society that we're all a part of, those are either unimportant or in need of suppression on behalf of power of the state. So the one way this plays out in terms of the First Amendment is viewing, so the First Amendment is the clause of our Constitution that secures religious liberty, free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government, those 5 freedoms. They see those freedoms as augmenting state power. So for example, religious liberty, defended in the First Amendment, is not about preserving the right of religious groups to operate, or be they mosques or churches or synagogues or temples, whatever they are. Rather, it's the right, it is the right of these organizations to operate insofar as they do a good job in shaping individual democratic citizens. So why do we permit, this one famous First Amendment scholar says, why do we permit religious liberty? It is so that we can shape democratic citizens. Now, so that's the perspective of the political community. So every aspect of it, we have to read through a lens of how does this augment state power. Now remember, state power for us is democratic, but it's still political power. How does it do that? The plural community, though, would say, well, our constitutional community actually exists. Yeah, I mean, one reason is to augment political power, and for us, it's the democratic citizenship. Of course, that's one thing it does, but it's not the only thing it does. It also preserves all sorts of social groups and the way in which they operate in society. So, for example, the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not preserve religious groups for the shaping of democratic citizens, although they do that. It preserves them for the worship of God or gods or whatever it is, those religious groups. There's a plurality of religious groups. And in our constitutional scheme, they are preserved as a good. And the ability of individuals to freely exercise their religion in these various religious organizations, synagogues, churches, mosques, or whatever, is because there might be goods that are beyond the political order that they may be accomplishing. Those goods could be social goods, they're integrating individuals. They could be that those religious institutions are in fact correct and they're reconciling man to God and saving souls. That would, if that's true, well, that would be a good and one that ought to be freely pursued. So there's a plurality of goods in our constitutional order. And my research specifically is on the right of association, which I believe should be embedded in the Assembly Clause. So the fourth freedom defended in the First Amendment. So that is the right of groups, social groups, including religious groups, but also non-religious groups, to form on their own basis for their own purposes, and their freedom to have functional autonomy as much as is possible in pursuing those purposes, no matter how banal they may seem to those of us on the outside. So in my book, I give the example of a chess club. I say, from the outside, chess playing seems particularly unimportant. I haven't played chess since high school. It's not something that moves me. I have no interest in joining a chess club. But for the people in that group, for a seemingly fairly banal purpose, it may be really important. They may be making friendships in that group and building connections that are really important to them. They may get some meaning from playing chess with other individuals that is just beyond me to comprehend why that would be meaningful. But that's not the point. The point is what's happening within that association and who is the best expert on how valuable that is. I would say it's the people in that group. And what sort of autonomy do they need to be able to carry out that function? Well, they would probably be the best judges of that. And so a right of association embedded in the Assembly Clause ought to protect those sorts of groups and all sorts of other groups, of course, along those lines. Now, why do I think this sort of conception of the plural community is the plural constitutional community? So a community that sees the protection of these, a plurality of groups, a plurality of authorities, especially focusing upon the lower level. Why is that the humane community? It's for reasons I talked about at the beginning. The ability to allow the freedom for individuals to be embedded in meaningful communities. And that makes possible, the functional autonomy of these groups makes possible deep communal attachment to them. That's healthy for individuals, from what we know of psychological needs of individuals. Some other elements that will be part of that is not just freedom of association, which I talk about in my book, but we might think of as federalism. So that is the decentralization of going down to not just state level or local level to try to solve problems where people will be more likely in a political basis to interact in a face-to-face way, governing themselves directly as much as possible, rather than casting one vote among 100 million, but interacting with each other face-to-face, or at least as close to as we can be in terms of self-government. So that's my where my research is going right now, is thinking about this idea of a plural constitution community and the meaning it might have for individuals. So thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Luke. So one thing I'm going to thank you so much. And I know that this, for many of us, is stretching our thinking and in areas that we don't often engage. One question I had for you, as I read your book and I think about Robert Nisbet, I think in many ways we're experiencing just the intensification of what he was concerned about. Sort of we sort of think about churches and Kiwanis Club and the Elks Club, and those institutions of large, some are gone. All of them have receded. So as healthcare focused people, and we think capaciously about health, about human flourishing, not just our physical bodies, not even just our psychological brains, but things around meaning and love. What do you think is sort of, and you mentioned this, but bring Nisbet into this particular moment. What do you think practically the receding of these institutions has done to us when you think about human flourishing in a broad sense of health?
Yeah, so that's what reading the Quest for Community is always interesting, because he writes in there's some lines in there where the first thing I think about is some contemporary issue. So he has a great line where he says, the deep communal attachments of friendship seems to be receding, and where we just care about the superficial symbols of friendship. The first thing I think about is, Facebook friends, right? But it seems like he's just talking about, that's something somebody would write in the last 10 years about Facebook. So bringing him into our moments, there's been kind of a lot of hand-wringing among political scientists and sociologists about the decline of all of these groups, the Kiwanis clubs and all of that. And it's been true for decades. So kind of the famous book on this in 2000 is Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. That people just don't, we used to do things together like bowling. We used to join bowling leagues, and now you just go and bowl by yourself. And that's true kind of in every sphere. And so what it does, and the damages it does, is those groups that can sometimes seem banal are in fact are ways of integrating us into these broader social, political, and economic networks. You go to your bowling league and you're chatting about the trouble you're having with your car, and the other guy knows his mechanic, his brother's a mechanic. And it's like, oh no, I can get you a good deal. And that saves you money. And and you've got a good connection with somebody who's going to do a good job in your car. And that whole world, Google, as useful as it is, doesn't get you those personal connections and the deals and all of that. And kind of underlying that is when you don't have all those groups, there's a sense of kind of constant anxiety and insecurity. So a sense that you're, like I start having car trouble. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to have to, because I don't know where I'm going to go for it. Whereas it's like, oh man, that's just something I'll have to bring up with Ted on Thursday night. Right. And so it's the increases we're seeing in anxiety probably stem in a great deal from our sense that we're not as integrated into the world around us as we should be. And we don't actually, there's all sorts of uncertainty, of course, that life brings us and presents us, and we don't know how we'll deal with it when it comes because we don't have those networks. Right. So Nisbet said, used to be you'd have your family, and which meant your cousins and your aunts and uncles, as well as all of their friends, and then your friends and your networks. So you'd have be connected by 2 degrees from hundreds and hundreds of people. Anything that happened to you in life, you'd get some help for somewhere in there. And we don't have that sense anymore. And I think that the widespread anxiety we're seeing is an increased sense that we don't know what we'll do if something goes wrong.
Yeah. And my theory has been that a lot of what we're seeing in the desiccation of the working class is probably driven by this as well. People with wealth and power can buy their way out of the loss of community in ways that more vulnerable people can't do. So.
Right. Well, this is an interesting point that J.D. Vance makes in his book Hillbilly Elegy. He says when he kind of transitions from being kind of the bottom of the working class, the dregs of the working class, to Yale Law School, he says the first thing he notices is they're really well connected. Have all these social groups and stuff. They didn't lose those, so they can either buy themselves out of it, as you say, or they kept. That's why they're in the upper class. They have all these connections, so they. He said that's their big advantage. They all get good jobs because their families are all really well connected. And whereas the lower class where he came from, it was there was none of that. So when you were looking to get a good job, you're just on your own. He happens to get into Yale Law School, but
right.
Most people don't.
Yeah. Well, it also helped that he put himself into a thick community of the U.S. military.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm open up for questions. I can continue interviewing Luke, but I was hoping that if anyone has any other questions, this would be a good time to bring those up. We have about 15 minutes left. Well, as we wait, maybe I'll pose another question. So, Claudia, did you have? I saw your.
Yeah,
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
So, wonderful thinking. It's. Thank you very much. Very, very important that we take ourselves out of just the caregiver role and think about the ultimate goal of what this care is supposed to achieve. That's where my head is right now. But my question is, when we're talking about communities, are we talking about, are we presupposing that there is equality among the members of the community? And I say that, and I ask that because if we're talking about this pluralism of the communities, do we not, when it comes to something like health policy, have a friction that's almost too heavy to overcome, so that the haves are not seriously concerned with the communities of the have-nots? because the structure of this pluralism is sustaining. It keeps us as a society, that we have the leaders, the producers, and the consumer. And so isn't there kind of a depressive ultimate situation when it comes to, let's say, healthcare practitioners wanting to influence the legislative bodies, the political side of these communities and the entities? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're asking if we have plural societies, we have all these groups, the sorting will be, well, the haves and the have-nots will be sorting. That'll be our pluralism. Did I understand that correctly?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and so what that kind of seems like it might exacerbate the sort of things that Grant and I are talking about. Yeah, so what Nisbet had in mind with that was that's a problem, but they kind of if you so the have-nots, if they're one reason they don't have anything is J.D. Vance gets into this, is they're communally separated. So the sort of mobility that we think about, usually praise, is not available to them when they don't have those larger connections. So that, you know, it's usually a myth of the self-made person. It's very few who actually do that. You usually have to have people around you who help you up. I mean, you have to work hard yourself too, but other people, and we can all think of in our own personal lives, there's people all along the way who are helping us along and providing encouragement and that sort of thing. So those, the have-nots would, for themselves, have those networks. So one reason they don't have, their have-nots is they don't have those networks. The networks have gone away. And so that's a big problem that's hopefully will be, structurally, that'll help overcome that problem. Another way in which the haves and the have-nots might be more integrated is through a plurality of communities. So, it used to be that it was communities could be more economically integrated. I think it was Charles Murray talks about how, was it Maytag, the owner of Maytag, like lived in the normal neighborhood with all the people who worked for Maytag. It's just his house had a pool and theirs didn't. It was like the difference. But they knew each other. They were neighbors, and they were, and so that might, with a plurality of associations, there'd be more likelihood of people connecting in other ways. So you might have the doctors work together and maybe live in a nicer neighborhood, but they go to church and to bowling leagues with working class people. And so we'll talk about this. I forget who I was reading. I think they lived in New York City and worked on Wall Street. So, and lived with other people working on Wall Street. So they're making good money and living with people who made good money. And then they'd go to mass on Sunday and, meal next to somebody who ethnically is different from them, was wearing overalls because they worked in landscaping. And so that was, and suddenly you're connected to people who are very different outside of your normal networks. So emphasis on the plurality of groups will hopefully bring together the haves and the have-nots and sort of all sorts of social connections in other ways that create personal connections. I used to have a friend when I was in grad school, and he went to church, and his home group, so it was like a Protestant church, and they're heavy emphasis on home groups, and he had this home group, and there was like 9 people there, and it was like him, a grad student, and then a clerk for Justice Thomas, I think, on the Supreme Court, and then a guy who had to leave the home group because he was hired as CEO of Boeing China. Like economically and socially a very diverse group that met once a week, and in a very small group, and all, took care of each other in the small group. So plurality of those sorts of groups is what Nisbet has in mind. And then the haves and the have-nots come together in ways they otherwise would never associate with each other. So the elites out of Harvard and Yale Law School don't usually associate with the other people in that group were just completely normal people, but there they were kind of on the same couch, and sharing a meal. So that's the idea, plurality of groups, and these groups will bring those classes together.
Yeah, so one interesting thing is, in many ways, I think as we're just sort of talking about church, it was a way that in many ways, these associations can also reinforce problems of division, right? Especially if they're too close.
Yep.
So in many ways, they can both reinforce division. And again, I think of American church, right? It has reinforced racial division, but to your point, it was an important source of class solidarity. And so thinking about ways in which, so the problem is not the association per se, it's the fact the association needs to think creatively about how to be broader, right? An even broader institution that brings not just classes together, but also racial groups and other ways that we sort of divide ourselves. But as the association disintegrates, we still have racial division and class division, right? So I think that's sort of the trick is often these associations, particularly like unions, were a great way to keep minorities out of good jobs in the mill, right? But now that unions are gone, there's no solidarity whatsoever. So again, I think the trick is to find the right balance between having the associations and making them broad enough to be inclusive.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they can. Nisbet's very clear. He doesn't have a romantic view of them. So they're necessary, but they can be, like you said, the unions is a great example. It's a great way of helping working class solidarity. And then it was also a barrier, though, to racial integration. So, I mean, there's kind of some interesting things going on, like evangelical churches, where you have kind of a bunch of white evangelical churches and a bunch of black evangelical churches. And they're kind of like, wait a second, how do we racially segregate? Like, unintentionally just ended up in separate institutions that accidentally are reinforcing this separation. And they're working on restructuring themselves to bring those together. So the associations can be have a means of reinforcing kind of some problems while they solve other problems. But Nisbet has this great idea. He calls it social entrepreneurship. So individuals who found new types of associations or new associations that solve these problems. So there are what you might call social entrepreneurs working in evangelical circles to bring together, to make those churches more racially integrated. What does that look like? Where do you start a church so that it's, in terms of its location, will bring people together? When I lived in Philadelphia, I knew people who were involved in doing that in the Philadelphia churches. So it tended to be the churches in the white suburbs and then churches in the black neighborhoods. And there'd be separate churches in separate neighborhoods. And how do you strategically locate a church so that it brings the neighborhoods together and kind of overcomes this division? So there's room for social entrepreneurs in solving some of these problems.
Yeah, thank you both, because I think what you've helped me come to in the discussion from the two of you is that the facilitator among and between, and maybe that's what academia can be, raising the consciousness of the issue and then suggesting solutions, that becomes a sort of facilitator where you can take the pluralism and make it work, as you pointed out, Dr. Sheahan, that bringing those differing groups together. But it does require some member of either pluralistic group to be the facilitator to want to do that. And so thank you, I appreciate that.
Anyone else have any questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Well, I'm willing to ask another question. So, one thing I often think about is, Francis Fukuyama in his book, I think it's The Great Disruption, talks about how these institutions that we were placed into, largely like families and religious organizations, we were sort of given to, right? And they're given to us as a gift, have been replaced by really Facebook, right? And it's a self-sorting, and not just self-sorting, but it's an algorithmic sorting into people that look and sound like you, right? That's literally what it's meant to do. What ways do you think that these sort of social media platforms, I'm very dour about these things, so I think it's just all downside. But maybe think about ways in which these platforms both reinforce and help, but also destroy our associational life together.
Yeah, yes, there's the social media commenced with great hope, and I think it's come back down to earth. Yeah, for the reasons you just said. And there's also the interesting research of kind of your sense of well-being is indirectly related to, is indirectly proportional, to how much time you spend online. That's like, the more time you're on Facebook, the less happy and integrated you're going to feel. Yeah, but I think it can be, it can be a mechanism of, sometimes they can be bad in terms of they just kind of stick you into your groups algorithmically, but it can help you find, maybe people who think the same way you do, and that can have its problems. You end up in an echo chamber, but it can also be a way of making you feel like you're part of a larger whole. We talk about the downside of that, but that might be a way in which I have found people who are on Facebook who are kind of we're like Facebook friends, but it ends up a way of keeping in touch, or people I meet at a conference and we're not going to see each other again except every 5 years when we happen to overlap in the same spot. Because we're on Facebook, we can keep in touch. And so it can be this kind of new way of keeping in touch. It just wasn't quite there before.
Yeah.
A really good example is I can keep up with my cousins. I have a couple dozen cousins and they're spread out all over the country. But now I can see pictures of their kids, and I can keep in touch with them in a way I just, as a practical matter, can't fly out and see them regularly.
Right.
There are those sorts of aspects to it that can keep that are healthy. There's just these really big downsides to it.
Yes. So one interesting thing that, these platforms you always have to keep in mind to serve the human person, right? In our good motivations, like the motivations to love our cousins. But in many ways, I think something flipped when they need to find a monetization scheme, a way to make money from Facebook, right? Because then their algorithms no longer serve the human motivations. Your human motivations serve their economic needs, right? So it actually kind of flipped. But I think there are ways in which always keep that in mind. In what ways does this technology help my life have more meaning? How does it help me love my neighbor better? How does it help me be more? So that's, I think, kind of the trick, is using the tool, not using the fire to cook your meat as opposed to burning your house down.
Yeah, right.
Trick. Yeah,
it seems like if you those things are really helpful as long as they just are kept in kind of the strict limits for the purpose you say. I'm going to keep track up with my cousins. I'm going to, connect with some people I meet at conferences, and then that's it. I'm not going to spend 3 hours a day scrolling
and abusing my neighbors. And abusing my neighbors.
That's right.
By yelling at them and telling them they're terrible.
Yeah, I kind of made it a no comment rule. If somebody says something I don't like, I'm not going to jump on there and how much I dislike it.
Yeah, well,
not what it's for.
Yeah, I could go on about this all day. So it's 10 o'clock, and I know folks have other meetings, so I just want to thank you, Luke. This was really great, and hopefully we'll find ways to collaborate going forward. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining. And again, we have one more colloquium for this semester. It's, I believe, November 10th, if I have that date correct, and it's a researcher named Hillary Barnes, who's a friend of ours, a friend of mine, and Haley's, who's going to be talking about role transition for nurse practitioners. So I think that'll be interesting. So again, thank you, Luke. I really appreciate you joining us, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Grant.
Yep.
Thank you.